but in one sense I'm glad that I don't have to do that. I just talk to you as the friends you are. I am from the Caribbean, and that means a lot for me, even though in many ways I am, as I was saying today to some students, I have become much more than a Caribbean person for the simple reason that I have lived so long outside of my country that that whole experience has modified me to a great extent, so that I'm in London sometimes, or in England, and people would say to me, the English would say to me, which country are you from? And I would say to them, well, I'm from the Caribbean. And when I go home to the Caribbean, the happy people from my country say to me, which country are you from? So in fact, I find myself being almost a floater in one sense, although I do have a very strong sense of belonging to my part of the world, to that part of the world I come from. But I'm also a father. I have a daughter whose only world is the UK. And as I was saying again this morning, if I say to her, I'm going home, she knows I'm going to the Caribbean. If I take her with me, she will say to me, Daddy, when are we going home? And I know she will be talking about England. So, and she is my daughter, she belongs in many ways, to me as a child. So that's the reality. And I find myself concentrating and thinking more and more about myself, perhaps as a citizen of the world, even though I have very strong connections and adherence to my place of birth and my birth culture, as we say. Okay? What do I write about? I write about the things which I feel are very important to me. In fact, I got a quote here from a writer, he was one of the first writers of a novel from the first novel from the Caribbean. The writer is called Vic Reed, and somebody asked him many years ago, what is his writing about? And he says, what I have attempted is to transfer to paper some of the beauty, kindliness, and humor of my people. And that he wrote that maybe 60 years ago, and it's still the same for many of us who write. It's to transfer, to convey something of the beauty, the kindliness, and the humor of our people. And that is what, to a large extent, my mission is about. Let me explain to you rather quickly what this book is about, this first one. It's a strange looking book, and I'm not sure I like the cover. Do I need a picture? But it was the first thing I did. I used to write stories since I was quite young. From when I was about 14 years old, I began writing. I was living in this very small island in the Caribbean, which is very close to South America. And it's so small that you can drive around it very quickly in about an hour if you're a good driver, and an hour and a half if you're not so good, and maybe 2 hours if you're very bad. When I was very young, I used to walk across it with many of my friends in a day. We'd get home in time for dinner. It is a very small country. The population is 97,000 people. It does mean that you can take all of us and put us in some corner of Amman, and without any problems at all. Yet, for me, it's a big country. For me, it's massive. It has many mountains, and most of the people, they live on mountainsides, they live on hillsides, they don't live in the flatlands, and so on, even though we do have flatlands. What was very important for me as a writer, especially when I began putting things down on paper, was to try to understand, like most other writers from that part of the world, and perhaps from most parts of the world, what is the nature of my people, essentially? Who are we? We are a very mixed bunch of people, and as I keep saying, any one of you here can be from my country. The only way I would know that is if you open your mouth and begin to speak to me and I hear the accent, then I know that you're from my country. In other words, we are not a country with a single race. In fact, we are very mixed. And as I keep saying, it's not unusual to find children with very dark skin, like me, for example, even darker than me, with blue eyes and green eyes, because they have a bit of mixed. There's so much mixing happening. The means, therefore, that even if the majority of the people in my part of the world are of African origin, you cannot say that to be Caribbean or to be Grenadian is to be African, if you know what I mean, because we are so mixed. And therefore, there are very important questions which we ask ourselves. Who are we? What are we about? Also, we are a very young society. We are a nation, we are a group of nations that began to form and come together, I would suggest, from about the 1940s, really, even though we had been there for 400 years. But independence came in the 1940s. And most of the people, the writers who were writing, and many of them, all of them in fact, left their countries and went to England mainly, and some to America, in order to write away from home about home. And that's a very important, exile is a very important feature of the writing of Caribbean writers. It's an extremely important thing to understand. And they were feeling that they were writing about the Caribbean and their part of the world. But perhaps what is even more important, they also had a sense that their models, their heroes, if you like, were T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, Shakespeare, for example. So they drew from the experiences of literature of Europe in order to develop these new kinds of books. And they have contributed quite importantly to 20th century literature. As some of you may know, some of the Nobel Prizes and some of the prizes in literature went to many Caribbean writers of the 1950s and so on. They were giants. The majority of them were men. And people like myself, I suppose that I felt quite small and intimidated when I began to write, because I had such great role models, and I always wondered if I would ever get to a point where I can write as well as they could, where I can express myself the way they could. They left a very strange legacy for the majority of the young writers in the Caribbean. In fact, it's almost like having very big trees and we small seeds below them, and we could not grow very well because they were such important writers and they did really remarkable things. But for us, we had to continue writing, and there are those of us who did write. We wrote about important issues, some of them very similar to what they wrote about. And I want to give you an idea about some of the themes that we address when we write. If you look at the second book, this book here, if you read anything from it, and I hope you do eventually, you will see sometimes it's written in different kinds of Englishes, because there is not one English. That's very important to understand. There are many different kinds of English. And perhaps what is crucial for our understanding of literature, English literature now, especially modern literature, is the fact that there is not one English. The Irish write different English, the Scots do, people who are what's called Anglo-Caribbeans, they write a different kind of English, and right now there are books which are coming out, which are being written by young people living in London, young ones, which are written in what I call youth English, youth speak, which is very different from anything we've ever heard. And I sometimes feel I need a translator to understand some of the exciting novels, but it's written in a language that the young people alone speak. And it's a wonderful, very vibrant kind of language. So as I said to you, there are many kinds of English. All right, so much for speech. Language is important to us, as I said a while ago. And I have very often had to ask myself, should I write in the language of my mother, my grandmother, people that I heard speaking from day one. I've had a very English education like most people in the Caribbean. But we do not speak English every day. It's only the really educated people who speak English. We speak a language we call Creole, which sounds a bit like English, but it's very, very different. And I have always had that difficulty. In fact, most writers coming from our part of the world have difficulty making decisions about what language they write in. I've decided to write in both, and sometimes I combine them. Before that, I was a poet. I used to write poetry, and I made a decision to write narratives, to write short stories, and to write novels for one very simple reason. It was that my country is full of poets, the Caribbean is full of poets. As a matter of fact, the first instinctive mode that writers from our part of the world adopt is poetic mode. There is hardly a novelist, I don't know of any novelist from the Caribbean who did not write poetry. That's an important thing to consider. There are those who are very famous for it, but most of them have begun as poets. I did, but for me, my country had no writers of novels and short stories. And I said to myself, well, somebody has to do it, and I will. And I switched, and I began to write prose fiction. There are some people who are still very upset with me about it. Despite the success of my prose fiction, they think that I should have remained a poet because that's what they felt I did best for them. But there are others again who don't care too much. They think that it's a happy thing. Now we have many novelists, or many people who are writing novels, so maybe I wasted my time. So, as soon as I began to write the novels and short stories, everybody said to me, I'm writing novels and short stories. I got very upset. I got very upset. We write about identity, we write about the effects of our colonial heritage, we write about other issues. What very few Caribbean writers have written about, and which I write about, and which I suppose I am reasonably well acknowledged for, is the fact that I write a lot about women. I grew up with my mother, and I grew up with my aunts. I grew up in a space where, in fact, my world was a world of women. I was very, very close to women, and I found that there was a space that existed that nobody was really looking at. In my society, I say this all the time, the backbone of our society are not the men. Men don't like it when I say it. In my country, they get upset. In other cultures, they don't feel comfortable. But it's a fact. Because what happens is that men tend to leave very early. From about 18 years on, they will just leave the country. They go to live abroad, to work abroad very often. So that when you go to the Caribbean, what you're seeing in front of you are women, children, and old people. It's almost as if there is a war going on and all the young men have gone to war. That's the way I compare it. And the women are the ones who keep society going, keep society together. And so for me, it was extremely important to address that, to begin to write from that space. And I've got so accustomed to it that at times people actually confuse or mistake me for a woman. If I hand a story, or a story is given to somebody to read around women characters, I get mistaken for that. Okay. So that's one of the things about my writing, which I just wanted to tell you about. Okay, I'm not going to talk much anymore, but what I'm going to do perhaps is to read a couple of things for you, and I'm kind of improvising as I go along. I hope you don't mind doing so, but I'll read some text for you to show you what I do with language. Some of you may have heard some of them already, and also I'll just address a couple of poems, some of which I wrote when I'm quite early, so that you get a sense also of what I was like as a poet. Some of them I have in my head still. Some of them I have. Some of them I have in my head still. Some of them, I've kind of tried to remember. I write most of my personal thoughts in poetry, the deep things I feel or see. So I will share a couple of them with you, and then I'll read a bit of narrative, yes? Alright. I like to write love poems. I really do. That's a wonderful effect on audiences sometimes. So I write love poetry from experience that other people may have lived. Okay, and this one is called it's in my head, and I've said it before. It's called For Two, and it goes like this. Okay, in rain we met, met and slept on the wetness of leaves. Leaves aged and decayed as my faith in love. I could have told you so many things. Instead, I chose to trace with cold fingers the contours of your face and watch my hopes decline in the darkness of your eyes. I love you, said my lips, hoping these words of a nakedness would give meaning to these ripple words. And then you stirred, your hair so soft, so wet, like mud. Love, my friend, you said to me, is only a memory of pain felt deep in flesh and blood. And then you slept while I wept on the wet earth till I could not tell who cried, the sky or I. That is a poem. Let's stop.
Okay, Jacob, I'm
no. And there are the other ones which are not rhymes. They're just statements. Like this one. I cannot always tell which part of you I carry in me. Sometimes it's your voice or what lies behind your breathing. If tonight I dream your name, it is because I say it every day. Every day I call your name and call again until my mouth is full of you. I cannot always say which part of you resides in me. Smiling, having fun. Not you, ladies behind there. But then again, I do poems based on a certain kind of violence that I lived through. Like in 1974, we had a demonstration which became a riot, which ended in the deaths of many of my friends. I was a child at the time, or a young man, right? Not a young man, but a boy at the time. And I remembered it, seeing, these children getting shot. And I wanted to get a sense of the violence and the senselessness of it. So I drew on the language patterns of my people. So even though it's English, the language patterns, the way we use words, are very much Caribbean or Grenadian. And I read it not too long ago, in fact, in Grenada, after many years, and the young people kind of got really excited because it sounds a bit like rap. But I was saying rap is long before rap existed, kind of thing. It goes like this. 1974, gun, smoke, white, rip, sky, chair left, rough right, break, center, made Grenada quake and shake like a child with ague. 1974, the fear creep, deep, kill, sleep, and all hearts cease to beat while we reap seeds of faith and agony. And my grandmother shake, she head in the wind, she says, something is happening, and soon the time will come when no moon, no sun, no rain, no gun will stop the stomp of the people's feet or clamp down when it starts. The fire bitter and the river flood of words pouring from Canadian stars. And we lived 5 years before we see the truth of what she said to me. 93, gun, smoke, wild, rich guy, jail left, break center. But it happened again in 83. Okay, it's a circular poem. So that's a very Caribbean poem because of the rhythm and the circle word. So if you look at and there are those which are to do with pieces of feeling, a bit like the love one. And I'll just do a small piece for you. I write my thoughts, if I can't write it as a short story, I tend to write it as a note almost to myself. And one of the things I've noticed about my people is the way the church, Catholic Church, has some kind of grip on them and on their minds. And it's not always positive, because the church was also a tool, a weapon, that was used to keep people's minds in a certain place, to accept slavery, to accept oppression. And I used to live on a street called Melville Street in St. George's, because the town is on a hill, a bit like this one, very steep. And I would see in the morning, very early, and in the morning when it's about to become daylight, the whole world is blue, or a very deep purple. That's the way it looks. Anyway, and I would see these shapes walking up the street towards the church. And the street is called Church Street because there are many of the big churches like the Anglican, Protestant, they're all on that street. Big stone buildings, massive buildings. And I used to make notes for myself sometimes according to how I felt. And this is one I found again. When we try to sound like a church as children, we used to go long gone, gone long. That's the bell, you know, bing bing, long gone, gone long, gone, you know. That's what we used to do. So this one is a bit based on that. It's very short, and it's called Church Street, surprisingly. In the morning dark, my people walk to the time of flocks whose hands have spanned so many years. And the church bell tolls, fading, ever fading beneath its shell of stone, hard as the heart of blue-eyed men, long gone, gone long, long gone to dust and gold. That's it. Yeah. Right. Why am I reading poetry? Because I've done so much of the short story stuff. I'll do a little bit for you in a minute. And I don't know if you will connect with this one, but I'll do it anyway because I've not done it before. It's my most recent note, like the one I just read. It's not rhymed, it's images. And I did it when I was in Senegal about a year and a half or 2 years ago. Do you know anything about Senegalese art? Sculpture? No? The Senegalese sculpture is a bit like, it's like, it's very, a human form would be very, very long, very stylized, very, very much like that. Very dark. Senegalese people, the Wolof people, they are very tall people. They're very magnificent to look at, beautiful and extremely dark. So dark they look blue sometimes. But they're very beautiful people to look at. And there's a dignity about them which I quite like. But something that struck me when I was there was the amount of young people who were blind and they were begging. And they have these amazing voices that they've developed because they need to call attention to themselves in this massive tongue called Sarakunda, very big, amazing voices, but beautiful people, many of them walking around just blind. And I learned later on that it was the water that when they wash their face or whatever it is, there's a thing that goes into the eyes and blinds them. And I used to watch the women in the early morning when the sun comes out walking, and the sun would throw a very long shadow behind them. I did not a poem, it's a short piece, which I'll read for you. I hope you get something from it. A long woman drags her shadow down the red dust road, eyes arid as a saltland's hair, her shout so deep it becomes earth and distance. And the blind boys too, thin and dark as sprout, have voices deep-throated as old oboes. I watch their slow feet groove the dust, past the thick cloth shadows of old baobabs, the unsteady drift of boats traversing life like carvings. They are the one true sadness here, the one real darkness on this land. Like the Christ I saw amongst them, sitting in the heat of Sarakunda on a slab, sleeping, the heat of Sarakunda on a slab beside the road, so dark his body absorbed light. And I might have missed the point completely had not the children half paused in passing to wonder at his nakedness. That's it. Okay, and it's about right. One of the blind ones, he was on the road sleeping on a slab of stone like this. Beautiful, because he was covered in ashes. He was naked, covered in dust. Which is where I got the title from this book, Really Classic Dust, because there's a link between this country here and West Africa that you may not know or may not have thought of, which is the dust. This dust that we had a few days ago, that dust travels amazing distances. Sorry. Yeah. That dust travels amazing distances. It's a dust that links this continent in incredible ways. So that if you go, you call it the what? Hamasini. In the West Africa, something they call it the Hamata. Very similar name, in fact. And this dust travels from the Sahara all the way down, and sometimes it crosses the Atlantic. Yeah, and I remember being, as a little boy, my mother would put her washing out on the line, you know. And for some strange reason, it's a perfectly clear day as far as we could see. I know lovely white sheets and pillowcases and so on hung on the line, and they begin to drip this brown water. And she would be upset, and I would be mystified. Where is this dirt coming from? Many years later, I learned, in fact, it was dust from the Sahara, which got in the stratosphere and traveled all across to the Caribbean. And in other words, we are linked in all these very subtle atmospheric ways by these things. And I saw it here a couple of days ago, and I said to myself, it's the same dust. It's the same dust that upset my mother in you know. Sorry? He goes to the Caribbean. Yes, yeah. So really, it's about that, yeah? I can pause here if you want to ask questions. So this is part one. Part two is the part two. I hear you thinking. What are you thinking?
I want to ask you about to read something of romances as well as
sorry, didn't hear you. You got a lovely voice. Very soft voice. Say it again.
If you have anything which you talk about romances as women, as love, as to read it. To read a poem.
A love story.
Love story.
Can you read a love story? I have one, but it's very long.
Short story.
Short love story.
Part of the love story.
To read something about your...
Yeah, I will read it a bit.
Yeah.
I will read it a small bit.
I want to leave personal writing to poetry writing.
Am I going to leave it? No, not.
Or just
Maybe I will combine them. I stopped writing poetry, as I said, many years ago, and I still write things. And as I said to you before, there are people who are convinced that I should continue with poetry then. And maybe I will, I don't know. But I have some books that I want to finish. They're either in my head or they're on paper. I'm not finished yet, or they're just about to be finished. And I must do that. It's a part of my life mission that I've set.
why do you think concentrate on the writing or still writing?
Why did I?
Why do you think concentrate only on one field?
Oh, okay. Why didn't I just choose a short story or choose the novel and stick with it? Because I think that all writing is connected, eh? All creative writing is connected. And I believe that a good writer of short stories can be a good writer of novels also, although some may refer to one, as my colleague here, has focused on one for a very long time. I think that poetry might be a bit different, but if you read my short stories, you can see where the poet comes in. Sometimes you have elements of the poetry in terms of the way I use images and so on. You have that. The reason why I haven't really stuck to the novel is because the novel takes a long time. It is a very, very demanding. And I was writing this book which has taken me more than 10 years now. I say 10 years because it's a nice round number, but it's actually a bit more than that. And I've been writing this novel, and occasionally I will take a break and write a short story or two. So what's been happening in practice, these books have come out in the interim. While I'm writing novel, these are like intermissions. These are like, you take a bit of a break, and then I go back to the novel. And it's a big novel, that first one. Very big in fact. I counted the words recently. Computer almost crashed in fact. It's very big. It's sort of 1 million words. It's a very big book. And I've been told that I must cut it down. But it's 25 years in the life of a country. So it's a very big and challenging thing to do. I will never ever do it again. That means that my second book in the next 10 years I'll be an old man. I have a great fear of big novels. I think my approach to it was wrong anyway. I think there are two ways of writing, by the way, two approaches to writing. One is called the organic approach, which is where you sit down and you begin to write, and whatever comes, it comes, and it takes, and you just go with it. That's a long process. There's another one where where I call the structured approach, which is where you plan it in your head in many ways. You work out, what you want to say very clearly, and how you want to say it, and then you begin to write. And sometimes, of course, the organic creeps in, but you have an idea. And I have a great friend who's a great writer, who writes very, very structured in a structured way. Her name is Bernadine Evaristo. She says, I'm going to be doing this book in 1 year's time, and she does it in 1 year. Very simple. Me, I would say in 1 year, and 9 years later on, I'm kind of wondering what happened. So, and I have actually begun to adopt an approach which is going to allow me to write maybe 2 years rather than 10. That's the reason why, to answer your question, that's the reason why I have one. Because I really want to do only the novel, but the short story had to be done because people say to me, what's the matter with you? Have you stopped writing? Are you dead? I swear. This book here came out 13 years. This here book came out here 13 years after this one. Now that is unforgivable, And one woman met me one day on the train. Not forget her, she's a good friend of mine. I hadn't seen her for a long time. And she said, you owe us a book. You owe me a book of short stories or something. You owe me something. I said, okay. And I had to add it. Yeah?
So where do you feel you belong?
Where do I feel I belong? Somebody asked me that this morning.
Well, I wasn't there.
Yeah, I know, no, I'm just thinking. It's a very difficult question in terms of belonging. I see it as, not so much as belonging, although yes, I do feel I belong but as loyalties. Yeah, and let me actually be very clear to you about what I mean by that. And it's very much tied up with identity. Okay? These books tell the world that I belong to a space that is Caribbean. Okay? I'm described as an Anglo-Caribbean writer or even as an English writer, and I know it's part of this strand that we call English literature. It's a strand of that. Yeah? So these locate me very clearly within the Caribbean because of what it says and because of where it's located. And I am very Caribbean, yes, in that sense also. And that's one loyalty I have, it's a cultural loyalty and so on. Belonging. But also I feel that, for example, what allows me to be here and talk to you, Jordanian people, and to connect with you in many, many ways, is breaking out of that very strong sense of belonging only to one cultural space. I don't know if that's making sense. Yeah? So that I have another kind of loyalty. For example, I'm not promising anybody that in 10 years' time, my next book is going to be about the Caribbean. It may not be. It may actually be about life in England, or indeed it could be about, I don't know, what it's like to be Caribbean African living in Jordan.
An aim to reach somewhere.
Yes.
That's the question. To reach somewhere, start knowing. To us,
Yeah, an aim to reach somewhere which, as a writer.
as a writer, as a human being.
Yeah. Yes, I want to be the best writer that I can become. I don't want to be better than anybody else, but I want to be the best writer that I can become. I want to realize my full potential as a writer. I want to be able to, I want to be read.
What's the standard?
My standard
The standard. The best.
that I can become. Not
no,
to be, not
but-
best, not, I didn't say the best in the world. That may happen incidentally, but that's, that's not the point.
Divine retribution.
Yeah, divine retribution. I'm not. Yeah, I'm very careful about my language. I want to be the best writer that I can become. All of that thing that people say that is there and I feel I have. I want. It's like a flower, you know. I want to bloom. You know, with all the potential I have, as a potential blossom to bloom, I want to bloom to it. That's what I want. That's my ambition to, and also to what's quite extraordinary is that I am a little boy, or I was a little boy, who began writing when I was 14 years old, in one of the smallest countries in the world. You cannot see my country on the map of the world, unless it's a very, very big map. Okay? It's so small. The village I come from is called Hope Vale, Valley of Hope, nice name. And if you look at a map of my country, a big map of my country, you cannot see my village. It's a very tiny village. So coming from that small space, I think it's miraculous that I have people all over the world, you know, reading these little books, and it meaning something to them. And I want that as a writer. I want to continue to have that. I want to continue to speak across cultures. You know, to people. You know, I want to transcend the smallness, you know what I mean, the geographical smallness, and go beyond that. I want to be a writer who is read. And I've happened sometimes, I have many young women especially. You want to know why? The writer about young women. There's a story here called Song to Simone. And there are many, I know this, and you might say it's arrogant of me, but there are many young women in this culture, in this country, who would identify with it. So if there's a girl coming to terms with herself as a young woman, and becoming a woman, yeah? Now, you may ask me how I know that. I don't know how I know. But I have met many young women, especially from my country, who come up to me and just tell me, thank you. I read that story, and you know, it meant a lot to me. I want that. I want more. I want that. I want to have that kind of impact on people. It's a long answer for a very small question. Sorry. But Walcott. And influence on me. Right? The question assumes that he has a true. What happened you have, yes. There is, maybe you haven't heard the question about Derek Walcott and his influence on me. Derek Walcott is just an extraordinary writer. He's a poet, and about 5-10 years ago, maybe, he won the Nobel Prize for poetry. So he's a very important writer. He is very important, not just to me, but to the Caribbean writers and to every writer who has come from a culture, come from a society which has been colonized, be it by Europe or whoever. Because Walcott was one of the first people to teach me that the language of my grandmother, the Creole language which we speak and which we call, call it dialect, call it pidgin, we call it many names, they are not very complimentary. He taught us that that language is a beautiful language if you use it properly. In other words, he was the first person to sit down and take this language from the earth, that people used to despise and that the majority of us spoke, and make something beautiful out of it, shape it and give it. And that is why he's so important for us. And in fact, the world recognizes him for that. His contribution to modern literature by showing you what is possible with a language which you think is nothing. It's an inferior kind of English, if you know what I mean. And that's why he is so important for me as a writer. And he also is a very deep writer. He's the kind of person that you really wonder if that mind is God. Is it the mind of Allah, God, or something? It's so deep that it's really incredible. When I read him, I have a sense, I'm in the presence of a great mind. He's really very, yes.
You made use of anthropological studies about your people, the surroundings, like, some old classics like coming of age, Samawa, things like that.
Not officially. I mean, have I studied my people as anthropologists too? No, I haven't. What I've done is observe very closely. I am an observer, I believe. I have the habit of observing. For example, one of the first things that when I came to Jordan the first time, and I'm here again, that struck me about Jordanian people. Well, there are many people struck me, but is it's a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of, I call it stillness. There's something about Jordanian people that I find very interesting. How about Jordan? I don't know. And I ask myself, why? Why do I feel this way about this society? Why does it seem to
What do you feel? What do you mean? Be frank.
this way? I feel, I'll tell you in a minute. But it's to do with
How do we sound?
how do you sound? For me, it's more how you feel. Yeah. And I think that a lot of the real life of the people of Jordan is not a public life. It's an inner space. It's a very, 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 very much in there, and I see it through the eyes of the women and the men. I don't think that you're very demonstrative as a people. I don't think that you're people who live in public spaces. I think you're people who live maybe in your private space at home or whatever. But the Jordanian people, for me, is a people who well, that's your view, maybe. I don't know.
We are.
Why? I'll have to find out as a writer, and maybe I will find out one day. But that's how I begin. I begin by checking how I feel about things, and then moving into it, looking at it very closely.
Because, you can't take one trait of culture and judge the whole
I know.
structure.
I know that.
And add to that, I'm afraid that Orientalists had already given certain image about the whole
But
area.
I haven't read it.
That's my question. I mean, through observation,
I haven't read it, just through my interaction, observations. Yeah.
to see your observation personally.
Yes. It's a very special place, and I think also that it's this place that is still asking very hard questions of itself. I think that it's a society that is.
But there is major difference.
Yeah, but I'm not. Yeah, but you can tell me that, but I don't know. But I have a sense of that, and I would. Absolutely, it's to do with the whole. I mean, I mean, every society.
Stop. And the reflections here.
Absolutely.
Because it's very close.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Half of them at least. So there are no reasons to like,
Absolutely.
I think that's the major. What major?
A little bit. Yes, I don't mind. What can I read you? I can read you something that
You want to read?
A bit of romance.
yes, I don't mind at all. I don't mind at all. I'll read a piece which is familiar to at least a few people here. But I'll do it to show you how I approach some of the questions I raised earlier on. About language and about issues. The first one is about first point I want to make to you is about history. Caribbean history is a very interesting one. It's a very strange one in many ways. And I'll have to say this rather quickly so you can get into this text and the reason why I'm doing it. It is because 400 years ago, which is a long time, Caribbean people were not, as I said earlier on, were not living in the Caribbean. There was another people there called the Amerindians, and they were wiped out within perhaps 50 years. The whole civilization was just wiped out and were replaced by Africans and other people from other parts of the world. And they arrived there, and of course they had to work on plantations as slaves. They were not free people. It was a very traumatic experience for them. There were, there are writers who deal with that. Toni Morrison, for example, Beloved. You read her book, you would know what I'm talking about. It's a very traumatic experience, that whole 400 years of slavery. And what's happened is that we are people who don't want to remember that. We don't want to remember, we don't want to look back at that. And if you tell the average Caribbean person, many years ago, I don't know about now, that you're an African or, you have African, they say, I'm not African, look at me. After you look at them, they look like an African. But look at me, I'm not an African. How can you call me an African? And they're being ashamed to be called an African. I think that changed a lot in the 1960s especially. But there was a time in the history when people were ashamed of that. So there's a kind of amnesia, a desire to forget about that very violent past. First thing. And second thing is the fact that this new language we created, because we were not allowed to speak the language that we came with. Our ancestors, Wolof, Mandingo, Mandingo, Yoruba, Igbo, you name it, couldn't speak any of these languages because, we'd be kind of punished or killed. So we had a new language which we evolved. And this story is about my people's fear of history. And it's also a love story. Yeah? It's a fear of history. And it's a very strange story because it's an act of the imagination. It's really about one of the ships 400 years ago, traversing the Atlantic, crossing the Atlantic, and in that ship you had these slaves. And what happened is that they all died or whatever. They jumped. Many of them jumped. 25 million were taken away. Only 5 million arrived. 20 million perished on the way across the Atlantic. So it's about, and here I asked myself, what happens if one of the people who jumped off that ship was a young girl who didn't drown but began walking across the Atlantic beneath the sea perhaps, and 400 years later she arrives on the shore across in the Caribbean? How would we, seeing this image of ourselves, who speaks the original language, who looks like who is African, how will we deal with that? In other words, if our history comes to us in the form of this girl, how will we deal with that? And the fact is that in the book here, you have to buy the book to read it perhaps, I don't know, but in the book here, it's about how we deal with that girl. This woman who arrived, there's one man who fell in love with her, and he took her in and all of that kind of stuff. And many years later, after the girl, she gets chased away. She gets hounded out of this village kind of thing. He is telling the story now to a young boy. And it's a storm that's happening because the girl came out of the storm. She kind of got washed up. Yeah? And every time there is a storm, he goes out hoping she would come back. But he's an old man now. If she comes back, she might be 20 years old still, who knows? He's maybe 80, I don't know. That's a problem, right? Well, not for some men. Anyway, and I'll give you a little bit of, I'll just read a little bit for you, not a lot, to show you how I use the Caribbean language and the Caribbean style of telling the story. And I will stop there. Right, here we go. He's talking to the boy and he said, she come on the curl of a wave on top of it, like you were sitting on the edge of a moving, rolling cliff that lifts you up and rests you down right there on the ground in front of me. I didn't see her come. I figured that out by the way she just appeared. It had to be the only way. A girl, naked as the night and just as dark, standing there in front of me, trembling from the wet. She must have said something, asked for help, tell me hello, something, I don't know. But I noticed her voice straight away, soft, as if it come from inside my head. She didn't speak like we speak, and I couldn't see her proper, except that she was slim and tall and she was in a bad way, like she was going to fall down any minute. I didn't think about the confusion in my head, all the questions that began popping up straight away. Maybe she was one of those foreigners in a boat out there with other people, and the storm dragged that boat from under them. But how she managed to swim across that kind of sea? Well, miracles does happen, not so. Don't think I didn't tell myself that I was mad or dreaming, that maybe my distress fly up in my head and make a woman out of air for me. But if it was distress, then I was very happy to stay distressed for the rest of my life. I fixed a bed on the floor for her. I do all this in the dark, with lightning that comes from the sky. And that night I sat down and watched her for a while, wondering who she was, where she might have come from, and how anybody could come out of that sea alive. I fell asleep on the floor with my head full up of all those things, and it goes on and on and on. Yeah? So it's this man telling the story, and the language is quite Caribbean, and the flow is Caribbean, and the more you read, you'll see what I'm talking about. It has a kind of flow to it, because every culture has a way of telling stories. Every culture has what you call a narrative style. In fact, I mean, that's what I'm researching at the moment, how different cultures tell stories. And the first thing I did, of course, was to try to understand how that Caribbean cultures tell stories. You know, the structures we use, the approaches, strategies we use for telling stories. Okay? And that's some universal features also, which is amazing. Almost every culture has some kind of features that they similar all across the world. In other words, the human mind works in a very specific way. And I have to say this to you, that stories are very important, as important as economics. Okay? I really mean this. And I'll give you an example of this. Think about you mentioned the West Bank a while ago, did you? Somebody mentioned the West Bank a while ago. And think about the two sides, if you like, that are in conflict there. Okay? The way the world perceives what's happening there really depends on whose story dominates. Are you with me? The dominant story, the dominant narrative, right, is really, and that shapes the response to what's going on there. Are you with me? Okay? Stories are crucial. I say this to my students very often, that history is explained, European history and colonialism is explained as Europe leaving to go to the West, to go to India in search of wealth, you know. And they forget that it wasn't only wealth that the West went for, they went also for stories. And you'd be amazed at how many travelogues and books were written at the time about the Gulliver myth story was one of those. And I have quite a few here that I've listed where, and so when people actually would come back, not with wealth, but with stories, and of course you have great gatherings just to listen to them talk about the men with three heads, you know, and the dragons and so on. All the stories, the Ulysses stories, yeah, the Greek and Roman legends and so on, they are about people collecting stories, because stories, they don't feed the belly, but they really feed the spirit and the imagination. It's a good point to stop at.
Thank you very much, Jacob.
I like small groups, actually. I do.
What you feel cold?
Yeah.
No, I don't.
That's nervous energy. I'm frozen.
You go, yeah?
Yes.
My God, and you actually sat there and took it. Wow. You should be applauding yourself, not me.